So now we're kind of ready to do, like we said, kind of focus on getting maybe a little bit of a mirror in here, kind of a door handle area, and really that side window, right? So really kind of the window stuff was really it's the same stuff we did here, right? We're just going to kind of use, we're going to, if you will, kind of cannibalize a little bit of what we already have of the car, right? We've already got some good shape starting points, and so it makes a lot of sense to kind of use those as those forms. Now, oftentimes car windows on the doors are actually kind of broken up into like a front, a middle panel, and a side panel. And there's no reason we can't do that or have them be one. I think it'll be easier for us to kind of break them up into their own little side panels. So I'm going to start with kind of the side here. So I'll hit 3 for faces on the, remember, first though 4 for object mode, of course. That way you can select the object you want, in this case car roof. And we'll go to 3 for face mode, right? 3 for face mode. And I want to get enough kind of right here for kind of the door. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to select that face. Remember, by default, Q is your selection key, and I like tweak as my default. But remember, Q toggles you through. You can, of course, assign those to quick keys. So I've got them set to mouse buttons, right? If you've got a 5-button mouse or more. And then I'm going to go over here, shift left click to select that one, right? Because it's kind of back far enough. And remember, the select menu, of course, has all of our selection tools, right? More or less to grow and shrink selections, loop and ring options. Double left click for selects edge loops, but I believe it's alt left, double left click actually selects rings, edge rings. And of course, select linked has a linked and shortest path. There is also the select loop inner region, which is actually quite cool. We haven't really needed it as much on this car, but when you're working with characters, creatures, it can be really cool to kind of select a hand or arm. We saw it a little bit on our crab creature at the beginning of the year. And there's things like the checker deselect, which we've seen a little bit, which is kind of cool. So remember, all your selection tools are in here. But we want select shortest path, right? And it doesn't have a quick key by default, so I did set my own up. Remember, right-click, and you can assign a shortcut. In this case, I've already got one assigned, so it's going to give me the change option. But if you don't have one, you'll see assign shortcut. And it's as simple as just clicking on that button and then pressing the key, and that's it, right? That's how easy it is. And it does that. It's your shortest path. It's kind of like your select in between, basically. And then, of course, we can hit Control-D for duplicate. Remember, that's in Mesh menu, duplicate. And this works for really anything. It duplicates objects. It duplicates faces, right? It's your duplicate tool. If you want to copy something, whether it's a whole object or just specific faces on an object, Mesh, duplicate, Control-D. It's got the default quick key, so it shows you it's a kind of important tool, right? So we'll hit Control-D. There we go. Now remember, by default, when you do Control-D, you can left-click drag and move it. In this case, though, I just want to left-click, so it'll put it in the position it's already at. So much like, when you Control-D, if you just left mouse drag, you can move it, which is actually really cool. But if you just left-click instead of hold down your left mouse button, it'll just duplicate it right where it's at. Now, in this case, it is part of this roof object still, right? It's still part of this object. That's where select link comes in, right? So since these are all part of the same object, right, so when I click back on it, you'll see it's there. That's where your select link comes in handy, right? By default, that's set to right bracket because that's also an important key. I'm not an animator, so I don't see why I'd want to waste a great quick key like spacebar on cycling through keyframes. So I changed select link to spacebar. Also depends on what menu you're in, right? These are actually context sensitive to the actual workspace you're in. So if I went to animation, spacebar would still actually do keyframe animation. So that's actually one of the underappreciated things about Blender, is that oftentimes the quick keys are actually context sensitive to the workspace, right? So like I have mouse button 4 and 5 set to tweak and circle select because I like using those a lot and I want them on my mouse. But if you're in sculpting, you can actually set those to some of your favorite sculpting tools. So believe it or not, you can actually use quick keys that you already used in a different workspace, right? Like modeling and sculpting, and it won't override them. So that's actually really, really awesome. It's one of those kind of unsung brilliant things in Blender. But in this case, I just want to select linked. By default, it's right bracket key, but I prefer spacebar. So right click, right? If you right click, it brings up your context menu for the stuff you don't use as much, but you still want to get to easily. And remember, there is separate selection, right? And that separates it into its own object. So there we go. Now you'll see that's its own object. And of course, we can go down to the door, left click on the door, because remember, 4 is object mode. Select the door. 3 for face mode. And I'm just going to select, I feel like these faces right here, but obviously they're not going to be quite as thin as those. We can always change that a little bit later on. So left click there, and then of course I can shift left click up here, and then of course select link shortest path. There we go. And we could do Control D, left click. And of course, if you go to face mode, you'll see that often a lot of these things are in here. Although you'll notice you don't see actually everything in these things, right? So keep in mind that mesh has your separate stuff, right? So they're usually all up in these menus, but they might not be exactly in the face menu. So I love having these up here because you can always get to tools there. But I actually, most of the time, use right-click because just about everything I need there is right-click. So I use right-click to get to the stuff I want, unless it's specifically something like, say, Solidify for faces that's not in the face context menu by default. So I just right-click to get to those options. It's easier than going up to the menus. So separate selection. There we go. And then, of course, if I want, I could select that one. And then shift left-click. Remember, 4 is object mode. Left-click selects, particularly if you're using industry compatible, right? And then shift left-click is shift adds. And remember, we're in object mode, 4, right? 4 for object mode. Right-clicking has its own object context menu, right? And one of those options is join. So separate takes whatever polygons you've selected, it separates them off the mesh into their own objects. And join takes multiple objects, makes them into one. So there we go, those are joined. And at this point, I might want to just turn off my car roof. Remember, outliner up here, right? We can go to car roof, turn that off. Maybe even door, maybe car body, just to kind of get ourselves, maybe just to the point where it's a little easier to work on the windows by itself. 2 for edge mode, right? And I could always just double left click on this edge loop. And Blender's pretty good about kind of stopping here at that start, right? And so that makes it pretty easy just to kind of maybe grab that, bring it up and in a little bit, just to thin that out just a smidge. There we go. And then, of course, you know, Q for my regular selection tool again. I could shift double left click, shift left click to kind of get these whole things here. Although, mind you, there is select loops, select boundary loop, right? That can select the whole boundary loop if you want it to. For me, though, it's easy enough just to kind of manually do those. So we just want to select all of the edges that are at the border edges, right? The boundary loops, the border edges. And then, of course, right-click, bridge edge loops, right? I do have a quick key for it because bridge is something I use it quite a bit. And that quick key will work for both bridge faces and bridge edge loops. So if you're in face mode, you go to the bridge option, you'll see Shift-B is there also. But that's a quick key I added. So there we go. Now in this case, you notice how it's giving me all triangles? That's because if we notice, this is 4 faces to 5. So in this case, I'm actually going to go in here and say, you know what? I'm going to take that edge loop, or that edge. And remember, if you hit delete, that brings up your delete options, right? Delete brings up all your delete options. Now, you can assign quick keys to specifically what's in here, but they can't be delete because it brings up all the delete options. So you notice I use Shift Delete for faces and Control Delete for edges. So that'll dissolve that. And dissolve edges is the important one because that takes the vertices with it. And now we've got 4 to 4, right? So remember, it's important that even though bridge will definitely bridge for your mesh, right? If it's not same number to same number, it will create triangles. Right, so you always want to make sure it's same number to same number, right? Same number of edge loops to same number of edge loops, same number of faces, same number of faces. You can't have 20 edge loops to 14 edge loops. It'll create a bunch of triangles when you bridge. It should be 20 to 20 or 14 to 14. So now if I right-click, bridge edge loops, there we go. Now, the shading looks a little weird. That's because oftentimes these normals are flipped. So I'm just going to do my select linked. Mesh menu has normals. Of course, you can get it through these guys here as well if you want to. But if you go to mesh, normals, flip, you see how you kind of get that shading the way you expect it to be? Really, you should see that shading like that. So sometimes if your shading looks weird, you might want to flip normals. That's also where that's going here and, actually, sorry, not there. Going here and turning backface culling on can be useful as well, because then you can kind of just see one side of the polygons. It depends on what you like for that, though. All right, so now I can bring back our body. And I got this light hitting my monitor right in the sweet spot. All right, so probably good there because that chair is sticking through a little bit. So this is where we can double check some stuff, right? There we go. So we can see in this case we probably might need to make some adjustments. That I can see that chair is actually a little bit in or a little far out. So my positioning is a little off for that. But that is okay because I can always go back in here. Select that. Remember, go to 3 for face mode though, right? So 4 for object, select the chair. 3 for face mode, I'm going to select that face and that face. Select linked, right? And then when you go to W to move these, it'll be quite easy to move them and have them line up with where you want them to be. Remember, Alt-X is your quick key for X-ray. And sometimes that's quicker and easier to kind of turn on to see what you're doing than turning these off. There we go. And now that's in there properly. And you can see it was actually off a little bit. It wasn't exactly lined up with the steering wheel. But by doing this in faces, it behaves with the mirror tool, right? If I go to Object and I do this, see how it screws up the kind of mirror features? So remember, that's better to actually do that thing to faces than objects, particularly if you want the symmetry to work properly. So Alt-X, there we go. Toggles your X-ray. There we go. So I put the chair the other day and I just didn't line it up perfectly. All right. So now we can go back to Window. There we go. And of course we could tighten this up, right? Alt-C. Let's go to 3 for face mode though. Alt-C. And I could just do a loop cut up here to tighten that up. Loop cut down here to tighten that up. Probably one more in there just to give it a little bit more. And you could always kind of bring these out to round off that shape a little bit. If you want your window to have a little bit of curve to it, it can. But oftentimes your side windows are pretty straight. I'm going to go to 3 for face mode. And remember, you could just, you know, click there and then shift click there. Shortest path. And then, of course, I could bring this down to line it up a little better. Maybe a little bit of E for rotate. Remember, your middle mouse button does view rotate just like it does view move. There we go. We just tighten up those shapes a little bit more there. Select that face. Shift left click. Shortest path. Remember, that's select. Shortest path. I'll bring that up a little bit. And there we go. And that will kind of get us that window. And then the rest of these will just kind of be the same stuff. I think at this point I'll probably focus on some of the other parts so you can see those. But you would really do the same stuff. It's the same repeat. You'd kind of build one here. You'd build one here. You could even easily kind of take some polygons off of this to make the little strip, right? There's usually that strip in between there. So that could be one of those things you could easily do that by going to 3 for face mode. Select those faces. Control D for duplicate. And of course, a quick face, solidify faces, go to the options box down here. Remember the little guy down here, you can click on it. And then we can thicken this to kind of create that strip. In this case, I think I'll go this way so that I don't have to flip the normals. There we go. And then, of course, we can always make little minor adjustments to this. But you see how we've kind of have that strip now? So kind of one of those things that you see how we can just build from what we already have. Right, by selecting some faces, duplicating those faces, and then oftentimes just separating them into other stuff, you can kind of build these things up. And that would just be the same kind of thing. We'd kind of grab these faces and bridge them and then shape them a little bit. At this point, I'm going to grab all the windows and combine them into one, right? So right-click join, and then I can just double-click on this and call it car windows. There we go. All right. So I think kind of those other small windows, since we've done it 3 times, I'll just leave that for you guys. What I want to do now is I want to quickly show you guys how to do the mirror. The mirror is really painless. I'm just going to select the body, 3 for face mode. And once again, we could use what we already have as a starting point, right? A mirror is usually going to be its own separate object. But I could easily kind of say, hey, the mirror should be about there. And I could easily select those faces, Control-Delete, right? Duplicate off. If I want, I could separate it, right? Which I think I will just to make it a little easier. We can always rejoin it later on. Separate selection, there we go. And then, of course, I could grab it, go to 3 for face mode, face. Select the face, of course, solidify faces. In this case, I'll kind of go the opposite direction for the solidify. There we go. Select linked because it does need to be flipped, right? Mesh, normals, flip. Now at this point, we really just have a start, right? So I can tweak that down a little bit just to kind of get it to match up a little bit there, bring that forward a little bit there. So we could easily just kind of get this kind of shaped and positioned a little bit better for us. Maybe bring that down a little bit. And what we could easily do is we could start to then grab faces and extrude them off. Control-E for extrude, middle mouse button. I could bring this up a little bit. Maybe E for rotate, middle mouse button. I could switch to this side face. Control-E for extrude. Right? If I want, I could go to 2 for edges, and I could tweak some edges a little bit just to kind of get that shape a little bit more, maybe the way I want it to be. There we go. And then, of course, I can go to 3 for face mode, select these 2. Remember, inset, right? It's right here. There's a quick key for it, I for inset. Middle mouse button, remember that scales that kind of in a little bit. It's like an extrusion. It creates new geometry here, but it scales it. And then, of course, if I want, I could do, Control-E and use the normal direction. In this case, I actually do want to use that normal direction. Bring that in a little bit. And then maybe another I for inset. Bring that in a little bit. Right, so extrude and inset. And now you can see we've got a mirror. Of course, we could adjust the shape a little bit. You can make it a little more dynamic. You could add edge loops, do extrusions. But basically, I just wanted to show you guys the simple, straightforward form for it, right? It's one of those things where you think, oh, I don't know how to make a mirror. You do, right? Believe it or not, you can actually build quite a bit of stuff just with things like extrude, bridge, loop cut, inset, bevel, right? You basically, 20% of the tools you use 80% of the time, right? So there's a mirror. And then what I wanted to do is go to the door. So I'm going to hit 4 for object mode. Click on the door. Now at this point, we probably don't have quite enough geometry to get the handle the way we want to, right? So remember, at some point, you want these to actually be subdivided, applied, right? You want that subdivisional algorithm to be applied. You see, if I turn this off, it's a little blocky, right? So, if I was to get rid of that, that's what it looks like in low res, and that's not exactly what we wanted it to be. Remember, what we're doing here is we're actually working in subdivisional surfaces so that we can actually get a denser mesh for us, right? So one of the things you can always do is go over here. And if you want, you could apply all of it, which if it was kind of like the hood or the roof, you would, because if you don't, it'll kind of pull the center a little bit. But since these are fully separate objects on the side that don't touch in the center with clipping, I can just go to the little kind of V here and just apply that subdivision, right? And now you'll see when I go to 3, that's what actually the low res looks like. So this is the kind of point that why we're using this subdivisional algorithm, right? Is most cars nowadays, in the vast majority of pipelines, even video game pipelines, are going to be close to this density, right? Particularly if it's a racing game. Racing games, cars are hundreds of thousands of polygons nowadays. if you're playing the new Spider-Man, right, Miles Morales, those cars are tens of thousands of polygons in that street city, right? Maybe not hundreds of thousands because that's a racing game, but this car when we're done is going to be tens of thousands of triangles. So believe it or not, if you are actually smart about the way you use the subdivisional algorithm, the subdivisional modifier, regardless of whatever software you're in, you're keeping the primary forms more straightforward and simple, letting the subdivisional surface modifier do a lot of the rounding for you. You'll find that when you go to apply it later on, that you have a mesh that looks great in low res, and that's still actually quite efficient, right? And this is when we can go in and do some of the really smaller details if we wanted to, right? All the big primary form details are easy to do with your main modeling tools like we've been doing here and a subdivisional surface modifier. It's little things like the handles that you might want to do a little bit more with in here. So it'll be kind of like 3 for face mode. And then I can grab these faces here. And I'm going to inset, right? So I'm just going to hit I for inset, middle mouse button to bring them in a little bit. Now in this case, if I want to, I can always do a little bit of shape adjustment here, right? One of the things we could always do is, delete those faces. I could always go 2 for edge mode, double click on that border edge. And you'll notice that if I have particularly things like my loop tools up here, right? So if we go to edit right there, and we bring up loop tools, there is something called circle. Remember, this is edit preferences. Most of you guys should already have this up, but if you go to edit preferences add-ons, right? Scroll down, and this is an add-on that comes with Blender, right? Loop tools and edit mesh tools. You just check those on, and these will show up in your interface, right? The mesh tools will show up here, right? Utility tools has flip normals. Face tools has cut faces, which is super useful for certain things. But loop tools, right? Remember, that's just when you kind of click on that edit tab here. Show up here, and there's something called circle. And we've seen this a little bit before as well. And you see how it actually kind of takes that shape and it circles it. I can hit R for scale to scale it in a little bit. E for rotate to maybe do a little bit of view rotate. And now we've got more of a circular shape if we want it to be there, right? So remember, you can actually do circle, and it kind of, is pretty good about, it has some options. You can click on that V, and if you want to have it do flatten or regular, so you can play with a few options here. But circle can kind of be cool at doing like that kind of shape quickly and easily. And then, of course, I can hit Control E for extrude. And you'll see in this case, right, remember F is your frame selection, so that'll zoom in your cursor. You'll notice that that yellow is lined up pretty well to the average normal direction of these edges. So as much as we usually use the middle mouse button for extrude, remember that for the default extrude region, that yellow is your average normal direction. So in this case, it's going to kind of find the average of your normals, and you can do stuff like this pretty easily. So you can kind of bring that in a little bit, right? Maybe R for scale to bring it in a little bit there. If you wanted to, you could always add an edge loop or two in here, or even at this point it's denser, you probably get away with a triangle or two. But it's also quite small and further away, right? Depends on how polygonally efficient you have to be. And then, of course, right, one of the things we could do is we could easily kind of fill faces here, right? So that edge loop selected, and that's just double left click. Right click, new face from edges. I can go to 1 for vertex mode, and I can grab these 2 vertices across from each other. Right click, right, because we're in vertex mode. Connect vertex pairs. And then if I wanted to, I could even go to 3 for face mode and grab that single face. You could leave these n-gons if you want to, though. Probably the easiest way to do a connect here is just your knife tool, right? K for knife. And I can just click on that vertex, and I can just drag all the way through to this vertex, and then hit enter. Right? Remember, your knife tool in Blender is really good, and it works quite well even on a subdivisional modifier also. So I've got these 2 faces selected. I could easily maybe do a quick I for inset, middle mouse to drag them in just a little bit, and then right click for extrude faces along normal. Maybe an R for scale just to scale that in a little bit. And then, of course, I can even grab these faces and right-click, extrude face along normals, right? Maybe a little scale in, a little move. And you see how you now have a handle, right? Now, of course, this can be separated off if we wanted to do a little more detail work. But you see you kind of have a little door handle there now. All right. So kind of one of the neat things you could do with that. I think that'll probably be a great place to stop for that video for the moment. I'll save that. But I just really kind of wanted to address some of these things today. Okay. And we can talk about a little about the shading normals some other time. But for right now, that's pretty good. And it doesn't have to be exactly that kind of door handle, right? It can be more square, but I just want to remind you guys you have the circle right feature. And that things like inset and extrude long normals and knife tool can be useful in certain instances, right? All right. So I think I'll stop that recording